Yes.
Okay, I'll do my best. Welcome, everybody. I'm Judith Rosenbaum, the CEO of the Jewish Women's Archive. Thank you so much for joining us to celebrate the launch of the Shelvey Hyman Encyclopedia of Jewish Women. Please introduce yourselves in the chat. Let us know where you're from. Make sure to chat to panelists and attendees so we can all see. And also put your questions in the chat and we'll be sure to bring them into our conversation. Before we begin our conversation with Alice, I want to give a little background on the encyclopedia. The Shelvey Hyman Encyclopedia is the culmination not just of 4 years of work on this edition, it also builds on a tremendous foundation that includes the original 1997 Jewish Women in America, edited by Deborah Dash Moore and Paula Hyman, and the 2006 Jewish Women, a comprehensive historical encyclopedia published by Moshe Shalvi and edited by Paula Hyman and Dahlia Ofer, which also incorporated Jewish Women in America. And then in 2009, JWA brought the encyclopedia onto our site, making it freely accessible to users around the world. The encyclopedia, I'm proud to say, now gets more than 1.6 million unique page views per year from around the world. This edition, which is renamed in memory of Moshe Shalvi and Paula Hyman and in honor of pioneering Israeli feminist Alice Shalvi, who we're going to hear from in this session, represents a major and ongoing effort to update, revise, expand, and redesign the encyclopedia. And going forward, we'll be continuing this in an ongoing process as the online format makes possible. My commitment to this project is both professional and personal, both to keep JWA's core content on the scholarly edge and accessible, and also to make sure that the work of my mother, Paula Hyman, which was so important to her, would remain relevant and alive. And I am very grateful and honored to be able to do this work and to help carry on her legacy. Before we begin our conversation, I also want to give some very important thank yous. This work had many, many players. Foremost, I want to thank Jenny Sartori, the editor who directed this project from beginning to end, from the biggest conceptual questions to the smallest administrative details. She held it all very beautifully. Our editorial board of nearly 60 scholars from around the world who were incredibly helpful to us in both the conceptual questions and reviewing content and suggesting new topics and authors. We also worked with wonderful interns and assistants who helped track down images, edit, upload, and I particularly want to thank Patrick Dash, our web producer, who built the web structure and implemented the new design. And last but not least, I of course want to thank the donors who understood the importance and impact of the encyclopedia and whose investment in this project made it a reality. As I mentioned, this is an ongoing project and would not be possible without the continued support of our audience and the users of the encyclopedia. We're really grateful to everyone who's already contributed to this event. And if you're interested in making a gift, you can always do so at jwa.org/donate. Thank you so much. So now the main event. I'm honored to be here today with Alice Shalvi, a pioneering feminist scholar, educator, advocate, and activist, and one of the people after whom the new edition of the encyclopedia is named. Alice was born in Germany and raised in England and made Aliyah in 1949, and she's lived in Israel ever since. She has had a hand, as you'll hear, in so many important movements in Israel. Among her many accomplishments, she founded the English department at Ben Gurion University. She ran the Pelech School for Girls and turned it into a feminist institution. She founded the Israel Women's Network and became a leading voice for women's rights in Israel. In 2007, she won the Israel Prize, and in 2019, her wonderful memoir, Never a Native, which I have right here, won a National Jewish Book Award. Welcome, Alice. So very glad to have you here with us today. Oh, wait, you are muted. Hold on one second. Let me unmute you. Can you unmute yourself? Yes, there we go.
Okay, right. Sorry. I said it's a wonderful event so far. I've enjoyed every session that I've been able to stay up for. Unfortunately, the times don't synchronize too well with Israel and my bedtime, but it's really been very, very good. Congratulations. I think it's a splendid event.
Thank you. So and I've been so glad to have you part of it. And of course, we'll be excited for you to be able to see the content in the recordings afterwards, which we encourage other people to watch as well. So there are so many places where we could start this conversation, but I'm going to begin by asking you how it was that you became a feminist. What was your feminist journey?
Well, it depends how you define feminism. I used to say the the simplest definition is egalitarian. In other words, equality between men and women. And I must say that I enjoyed that at home. I had one brother, 5 years older than myself, and it was always assumed that I would get the same degree of education, which was not the case at all, or not general in England. And most girls of my class left school either at 14 or 16. Those that went on to 18 did so not necessarily in order to go to university. And it was taken for granted that if my brother went to university, I would have the opportunity to go to university as well. And the other thing is that, one's parents model things. And there was total equality between my parents. They both worked in the family business. My father was very present, unlike the fathers of many other children. And my mother took a great interest, although she was not as active as he was in Jewish affairs and Jewish organizations, but she took a great interest in what he was doing. And as far as their Zionist endeavors were concerned, they were really partners. So I saw equality in practice, But feminism isn't just equality. Feminism is a completely different philosophy of life, which goes way beyond equal opportunities and equal reward to an entire conception of society and the world as one with less aggression, far more compassion, far more caring, which is a term I like very much. It has multiple meanings. And I think what I really see feminism as aiming at is not just giving women the opportunities that men have, but giving men the opportunities that women have. In other words, to eliminate gender as the major distinction between what one does and the other does. I'm afraid I'm still very much into a binary mode. I'm finding it very difficult. I know different modes exist. I know it in principle, but I myself am still very binary, try as I may to enlarge my view. And I must say, Zoe's talk helped me a lot with that. And of course, it was the other enlightenment that came was in Henriette Dahan's talk. When we talked about equality at first, at the beginning of the 1970s, I had my awakening as far as equal opportunities were concerned in 1973, when my ambition to be appointed as Dean of the Faculty of Humanities at the University of, what was not yet the University of the Negev, now it's Ben Gurion University of the Negev, was turned down, with every one of the men to whom I had to present my candidacy, my interest in the job, having as his first response, "But you're a woman." in amazement, and here was I thinking I lived in an egalitarian country. Men were paid exactly the same salaries as women at the university. I was living in a sort of cloud cuckoo land, actually. And that was when I first started investigating, what actually happens? What's the truth? And going beyond what I knew to a general picture. And that was really when my feminist activity began. And continued along those lines, and it's developed. The whole concept of not just equality of opportunity, equality of reward, but a far wider conception of feminism now is what I have, is what guides me.
Well, I love that you are acknowledging that feminism is always evolving, and that sometimes it takes us a while to catch on to, to wrap our brain, to train our brains to think differently about the concepts that we have grown up with and that therefore seem very fundamental, like binaries, which are always hard to undo and structure so much of our life. And I think that kind of evolution happens on both an individual level, as you're describing, sort of as you live your life, you encounter different things that, help you see the world differently. And then also on a collective level, that the feminist movement also has changed and has taken on new issues, or has acknowledged, as we discussed in the session on Mizrahi feminism, has acknowledged certain blind spots, or has acknowledged the failure of certain concepts like sisterhood, and kind of grown to encompass. And we do that at JWA too. We start with a certain body of material, and then we continue to think, okay, who's right. Still not being told in this story? How do we bring in the voices that are continually on the margins? What are some of the changes that you've seen for women in Israel and in Israeli feminism over your decades of work in that area?
Well, unfortunately, I'm seeing some regression now, because there are too many women who dismiss feminism or the continued aspiration to equal opportunities and equal rewards, to take the most basic definition again, on the grounds that they've made it. I've made it. I didn't have any difficulty. I'm a woman. Here I am. And that unfortunately applies to some of the women who've managed to get into the Knesset. And we have more women in the Knesset, I'm happy to say, than ever before. But I'm afraid, I haven't tested them yet, but I think there are several among them who would say, I'm not a feminist. I made it, I'm all right, everything's okay as far as women are concerned. There's no more need to fight for equality and so on. And that very much disturbs me, because we're still very, very far, if we go back to that concept of the equality, we're very far from equality. You just have to look at the Knesset. Yes, we now have more women members of Knesset, but there's still comparatively a tiny minority. We have more women in high-paying positions in business, some key positions, many women who own their own very large businesses. But first of all, to go back to Henriette Hahn's talk, this applies only, to the upper level, upper class, upper income female population. It doesn't apply lower down. The Mizrahi women, the Ethiopian women, to a certain extent, the average Arab woman is still in a position of inferiority in various ways, not only income ones, but as considered as less important in the household, um, less influential, uh, more prone to being treated violently. Um, and I think there's still a lot of victimhood among women per se, because they're women, right? And because they're really still in a very, very large sector uh, of our population considered inferior, limited, and are in fact. I mean, the number of women who are primarily homemakers, mothers, is enormous. It's the vast majority who are not in the workforce, and as we know in our society, working and earning at least part of the family income is very important as far as status concerns.
Right. Certainly,
To say nothing of the degree of violence against women, which has grown really exponentially.
Right, and
The
we see
corona.
certainly in the last year of or the year and a half of the pandemic that if that wasn't already obvious to people, it was made very clear, both in terms of both dynamics you're talking about, both in terms of violence against women, domestic violence, and also in terms of the caretaking responsibilities of women and the ways in which that affects the ability to work outside of the home.
Right.
Certainly. I appreciated learning that, taking a step back in your memoir, that that when you were a student at Cambridge University and were involved in the Cambridge University Jewish Society, that you advocated for women to be able to lead the singing of Zmirot on Shabbat, and then became the first woman to do so. So that even though you just sort of dated your feminist awakening to the 1970s, it sounds like you had the seeds of that earlier as well.
Well, you see, I always objected to the discrimination. You see, I was fortunate in not having a discriminating family. And so I assumed that anything a male can do, a female can do. And certainly as far as leading Zmirot, there was no reason why not. I mean, I don't know whether any of the male members of the Jewish Society, although there were some who were very orthodox, really objected on the grounds of hearing a woman's voice. You know, I don't think that was the problem. It's just that it never occurred to anybody that a woman could lead Zmirot, even though the Cambridge University Jewish Society had a number of women presidents before me. Not many, the majority, of course, were men, but then the majority of students at Cambridge were men. The women in my time had just 2 colleges, as opposed to 25 for men. So, and the women's colleges, interestingly enough, were officially limited in the number of students they could take in. So we were really a minority, which was not always pleasant, because, again, you know how things have changed, thank God, a little bit. You know, the learned woman was somehow considered abnormal. You know, it's, why should a woman go to university?
Right, she might risk having her reproductive organs shrivel up.
Yeah, right. So, I mean, we never thought of having a women's minyan. That came much, 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 much later. Well, 20 years, actually. But things that we could do, many of us wanted to do and were able to persuade the men to let us do. I think you have to have courage. You have to know what you yourself want, even if it means that you get known to be a bitch, you get known to be overambitious, you know, she's trying to be just like a man. But if you're clear as to your aims and feel that your aims are worthwhile, not only for yourself, for society, not only the specific sector of society to which you belong, but in general, then you have to have the courage to fight. And that's, of course, what the women did at Cambridge. You know, they were mocked, they were attacked physically, and they weren't officially admitted as members of the university until 1950. And that meant, even though we took the same examinations as the men, we weren't listed in the official results, right? And particularly when women first started studying at the university, by the time I got there, we were listed, but we still did not go to Senate House to officially receive, you know, to process to the Senate House to officially receive our degrees. That happened in retrospect in 1990, 40 years after my time, when the university celebrated the first class, which was my class, that entered after women were admitted. We went back, and everybody who hadn't had the opportunity to receive her degree officially at Senate House was invited back to participate. So there was some kind of admission of wrongdoing. And of course, there's total equality now. In fact, all the men's colleges have opened up to women. Several of them are headed by women. And my own college, Newnham, remains the only single-sex college in the university. And there's a great deal of discussion about that. I mean, I personally think it's much better for women until they reach real maturity and feel secure to study separately from men. And I found that at Pelham as well, that the single-sex school can give, no, not to put it the other way, that very often in a co-ed school, the girls shrink back. It's not that they're discriminated against, but that they almost discriminate against themselves. I had an actual example of that when I permitted a new boys' school to use our lab for physics for the boys who wanted to study physics at a higher level. And I didn't see anything wrong with it. They had no laboratory, we had a laboratory, and they studied together with our girls. And after 2 lessons, the teacher, male teacher, came to me and said, I don't know what's happened to the girls, but until the boys arrived, they would answer freely, put up their hands, go to the board to solve problems. Since the boys arrived, they don't open their mouths, they're shrinking back. Now, this may be because Israel is still a very sexist society. But I don't think it was only that. I really think that until the age of 18, it may be better for girls to study separately. I hate the thought. I hate to think I'm right, but I'm afraid I still am. And again, this, if you link up with Israel, why this may be specifically so in Israel, it's because although women now play far more significant roles in the Israel Defense Forces, there's still this clear distinction that only the men go into physical combat. And of course, so the girls are denied, quote unquote, the opportunity to show the heroism which somehow is attached to fighting in the front lines.
Right. Well, it gets back to what you said earlier about needing courage to speak up and to demand things. And I think it's so much of the work that we have to do is about how do you cultivate that kind of, how do you help women and girls cultivate that courage? How do we model
Absolutely.
it?
Absolutely.
And how do we at the same time unlearn what many of us have learned very deeply, which is that one of the most important things is to be liked. And, I think that is something that also takes a lot of work and modeling to be okay with speaking out, no matter how that means you're going to be received. And I think that's still, I see in the work that I do with young people, that is still very, very deeply ingrained for a lot of women.
Well, what first got Moshe started on the Encyclopedia, first of all, was his total identification. He was an egalitarian from the first. We had a very egalitarian marriage. But when he retired, one of the first things he did was he had this idea about an encyclopedia. First, it was going to be a world encyclopedia of women, but then he soon realized that was perhaps a bit too much to bite off. And then one of the first things he did was to compare the number of entries on in the Encyclopedia Judaica, which was a major work, 15-volume, very, very comprehensive encyclopedia in which he was involved, to compare the number of entries and words actually dedicated to women. And it was a tiny, tiny fraction. And he realized how unjust this was, how untrue to history it is, right? And that made him decide that the time had come that there should be a separate encyclopedia which would showcase the achievements of women as well.
Well, I think it is wonderful that he was able to notice that. And it was, I'm sure, related also to having spent so many decades married to you. The two of you were married for more than 60 years. Moshe was obviously a very special, special person. And I think often, that there's sort of the truism that behind every great man, there's a great woman. And I think one of the things we were doing that we think about in the work of the encyclopedia is that rethinking how we define accomplishment to tell some of those behind the scenes stories and to give credit where credit is due to all different kinds of leadership, some of which is out front and some of which is behind. But I think it's true not just behind every great man, that women also, when we have public roles, we have people who we rely on, and sometimes those are other women, and there's a lot of feminist work to be done to acknowledge that fully. And sometimes it's men in our lives also who support us and make that success possible. So it is very important to lift up Moshe's work in that regard as well.
Yes, and I'm sure he would be very happy. Perhaps he is in the next world watching benignly to see the EJW developing so wonderfully.
Yes, and you also worked as an assistant editor on that project. I know from looking through my mom's papers, seeing many, many copies of essays with your editorial notes on them as well.
Yes.
Let's take a step back. I'd love to hear a little bit about at what point you realized that you were going to build your life in Israel.
Say that again.
At what point did you decide that you were going to make Aliyah and build your life in Israel?
Well, I grew up in a Zionist family. As I said, my parents were both active in the Mizrahi Zionist organization, the religious Zionist organization, which was much more moderate in those days than it is today. And I had two cousins who were on Hachshara already in Germany when I was little, and I admired both of them very much. And my dream was to be a chalutza. And I remember at the age of about 5, dancing a lonely horror around the kitchen table because I was a very lonely child. My brother was much older, didn't want to play with me, and dancing this horror and singing Anu al olim arza lifnot ulhi banot. We are going up to the land to build and be built. And I realized that it's not that I was consciously inculcated with it any more than I got my orthodoxy, my religious practices, in a calculator, where when you grow up in a certain atmosphere where things are sort of taken for granted, of course, right? The blue JNF box in the entrance to the house, and putting money in every Friday, we put in loose change into the JNF box. And the dream of Aliyah was very, very much present. So that, and the same is true of my brother. My brother was a very ardent member of the Zionist youth organization, and had hoped my mother had hoped to send him with youth aliyah to Eretz Israel, to Palestine, but he was too young. And that assumption, almost natural assumption, that we would end up in Eretz Israel at some point. And I think if it hadn't been for World War II, in his case, certainly delaying his studies and completion of studies, he would have come much earlier. As it was, he came only at the age of 70. But I've been going through, I've inherited a lot of his papers, and he was a person who never threw anything away. You, as a historian, will know how important that is. And what I found among his papers were copies of letters he sent to someone. The name didn't mean anything to me, but at Hebrew University, as one of the 10 best finalists at the London School of Economics in his field, he wrote to this person at the Hebrew University asking whether there was a Department of Economics, in which case he'd like to present his candidacy for a teaching post. And if not, he would like to establish one. Now, as far as I gather from his papers, he never received a reply, because had he received a reply, he would have filed it together with copies of his own letters. He was an archivist's dream, actually. So there was that desire to I'd say it was more than desire, it was an intention, kavanah. There was a kavanah to go to Eretz Yisrael, La'alot Arza, to go up to Turkey. And it was very much in the air at home. And I think that if it hadn't been for World War II, my parents and my father's illness immediately afterwards, my parents would have come on Aliyah as well.
So, well, let's show a couple pictures from that time, actually, before I ask you your next question, which brings you more up to the present.
What?
I'm going to show a couple pictures from that time, because I think
it's always fun to see that. So. Well, the one on the left is me with my mother when I was about 3. The one in the middle is me with my brother when we were evacuated to the countryside during the war. And I think I'm 14 or 15 in that photo. And the one on the extreme right is me with some of my fellow students at the London School of Economics where I went to study social work in order to have a practical background for coming on Aliyah. I didn't really think that English literature was going to be much use. It turned out that social work wasn't much use, because when I finally came on Aliyah at the end of 49, the potential clients for social workers were not, as I'd expected, Holocaust survivors, but rather the New Orleans from the Arab countries. And whereas I speak several European languages, I didn't know any of the appropriate languages for that population. And actually, because I was in despair of not being able to earn a living, once I thought I should be independent, someone happened to mention to me that the Hebrew University was desperately looking for teachers of English, because there was a very large enrollment. It was the first class to enroll after the War of Independence, when the university reopened, and a foreign language had become a requirement. And of course, most of the students chose English, and they desperately needed teachers of English. Now, I had never intended to take up teaching. In fact, it was a despised profession in my time. I realized why, because women who were teachers were compelled to resign when they married.
Right.
Until World War II in England, married women ever taught at schools.
In the US,
So,
it was the same
so
policy.
the image of a teacher was, a spinster, an old maid. Well, what young graduate wants to be an old maid? But I decided that I would try teaching. I wanted to earn a living, and I would try until I managed to learn some Arabic or other dialects. And I discovered that I adored teaching. It's the most rewarding profession. It is so wonderful to feel that not just that you're inculcating knowledge, but that you are helping people to develop skills, to develop ideas, to grow. Interestingly enough, the first 2 years that I taught at university, most of the students were much older than me. I was 23, and most of them had been through the Jewish Brigade, or the British Army, or then the Haganah. And they couldn't understand why any young woman should come from England to what was at the time severe austerity in Israel. And they really adopted me. They were very good to me. They helped me to acclimatize. And many of them became very good friends. And many of them became my colleagues as teachers at the university. So I really found my shlichut, my purpose in life, quite by chance. And in fact, if I may just philosophize for a moment, I've found that most of the things that I have done and even achieved, if I may say so, have been pure chance. Pure chance, nothing planned. The question is how you rise and respond to a challenge. Over and over again, this happened. I didn't seek to be the principal of a high school. It was thrust upon me, and I feel a bit like Malvolio. Some are born great, some achieve greatness, and some have greatness thrust upon them. And I think that's more or less what applies in my case. Partly because I'm always willing to take up a challenge. not everybody is. You know, when the opportunity came to be involved politically, and my colleague Frances Adai said, we need a women's lobby, I said, okay, let's do it. And I think this readiness to act, sometimes very spontaneously, without prior thought, without prior planning. But I think this spontaneity has led me to much of what I've accomplished.
That is a very helpful thing. I think it can be, there is so much that can emerge just from who you meet, and as you said, sort of rising to challenges, recognizing problems that need to be addressed and stepping into the breach, I think also is part of it. And certainly I'm grateful for the ways that you've done that. And I think I'm going to stop the photos for a moment. You know, I think one of the questions I had for you is, you know, on the one hand, you've had all these different parts of your career. You know, you've been a scholar and a teacher, an educator, you've been an activist. And I'm curious how you understand the relationship between all of those parts of your work. Do you see them as very different kind of chapters, or do you see them as kind of all of a piece?
Well, insofar, you know, it's like a jigsaw puzzle where different pieces fit together to become one picture. And the picture is of my life. I think there's one, or to take a musical metaphor, that there's one theme which runs through the entire work, the entire creation. And I think the theme in my case, I would say is twofold. One in aim, that I try as far as possible to, not deliberately, but you know, it's sort of instinctively, to be involved in what is broadly called tikkun olam. And once I feel it's the duty of every human being to contribute as much as possible to their world, the welfare of their world, the welfare of their fellow human beings. And then, as I say, you know, as opportunities crop up, I seize them, perhaps too readily. I may be, I don't know what to say. Some people accused me at various times of being very superficial, because, you know, I keep jumping on different bandwagons. I don't think I'm superficial. I think well, I hope not, so far as not to judge, because I've tried to do everything that I began doing spontaneously as thoroughly as possible. Never as thoroughly as Moshe. I mean, I must say he was the most thorough person I've ever, and very, very skillful at planning, as the EJW indicates, you know.
Yes, it's good if you're going to take on a giant project like the Encyclopedia. I would say being thorough is very good, but I can't imagine anyone really calling you superficial. You've done such deep work in every area that you've worked. I mean, you also have been alive for a long time, so you've had a lot of time to take on different projects. That's one of the beauties of a long life, is you have many
yes. Well, I think my days of taking on new projects are unfortunately over. I just do my best to continue the projects with which I'm involved, like the New Israel Fund, which I think is doing wonderful work. In other words, my Tikkun Olam now is channeled by a wonderful organization. And I continue insofar, again, it sounds very conceited, insofar as the way in which one lives one's life can set an example to others. And I try. I don't necessarily succeed always. There's a limit. Unfortunately, there's a physical limit. But thank God my mentality, my brain is still functioning.
And you have been an important role model for generations of women, and we are incredibly grateful.
Well, I hope so. I think so. I mean, young women keep coming up to me or asking to meet me in order to get my advice on things. And the number of them who say, you're my role model, just overwhelms me. So I still can't quite accept that I'm anybody's role model. But I think that if you live your life well, then however undeliberately you become a model, you know. Well, the encyclopedia is full of them, you know. People, if you dare to start on a new path, or to further explore an old path, because you feel that it's something that needs to be done. You know, it reminds me always of, what was his name? The first man to climb Everest, because it was there. Because it was there, and it needed to be done. I don't think climbing Everest was that essential, but when things need done, you have to be prepared to step up and do them. And if you succeed, you succeed, and if you fail, you fail. And I have to confess that I've failed in many things, that in the end, perhaps because I went too far in going beyond what was acceptable to a particular group that I was part of, I ultimately had to leave. It happened at Pella. Once I I dared to meet Palestinian women at a time when meeting Palestinians was forbidden, which was a life-changing experience for me, because it was the first time I'd encountered Palestinian women of my own degree of education, similar backgrounds in various respects, professionally. And it was, and apparently this was unacceptable. When I came back from that first meeting with Palestinians in Brussels, which, as I say, was life-changing for me, two of my teachers immediately resigned. They refused to go on teaching at a school headed by someone who had dared to meet Palestinians. So sometimes you win, sometimes you lose, but you know, the ultimate effect was good. When I think of the number of my students who are involved in relationships with Palestinians, dialogues of various kinds between Jews, Muslims, Christians, when I see the impact of those graduates from my time who are now serving as women rabbis, inspired. Right. This was just, it wasn't on the cards. An Orthodox woman as a rabbi, you know, and I feel so privileged to have witnessed this change, I mean, the change in my time, not only in the Jewish society, but in general, the advances made by women, the achievements of women, the acknowledgement of women, still not enough, but at least it's happening.
I want to turn for a moment to your memoir, which you titled Never a Native. And I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about what you feel it has given you to be able to be somebody who's always been a little bit on the outside. I mean, I you know, you've won the Israel Prize, so it doesn't seem like you're quite an outsider in Israel, really. But I understand that as an immigrant, as someone who studies English literature, as an Anglo-Saxon
Yes.
in Israel, there's a certain bit to that. But I wonder if you see that lack of nativeness as a source of strength, or does it give you a certain perspective on the world that's been important to your work?
Well, you know, it gives one, I think you're right, it gives one a perspective. There is something, or that's much better to be an insider, I think. But there's something to getting a different proportion, a different view of life by being the outsider, and seeing and being, as a result of being the outsider, questioning the traditions, the assumptions of the inside. But continually to be an outsider, in a way, is distressing. You know, you're never really one of them and or one of us. And I think perhaps what I found most distressing is too extreme a word, but not being what is known as an Anglo-Saxon in Israel. I mean, it's so ironic that I should be an Anglo-Saxon, you know, having been born in Germany to Galician parents. I'm about the furthest thing from an Anglo-Saxon. But after all, you know, education also determines who you are and how you see things. But I'm sorry that I've never become really, how shall I say? Well, you know, an Israeli by birth. I'm not a Sabra. I see things differently. I come from a different background. My perspective is different. My education has been different. And I think being an outsider has certain advantages because you have a certain greater objectivity about what surrounds you than someone who's grown up with it, or grown up with certain basic assumptions. But let me put it this way, I'm very happy that my children really feel that they're Sabras, that feel much more, well, they're Israelis, you know, from birth, from the beginning. And my grandchildren even more so, you know, and here we are, photographs, yes.
Yes, we didn't mention yet that you're the mother of 6, and the grandchildren, the grandmother and great-grandmother of I don't even know how many.
The only photo here that has all of my own children is the bottom left, which was taken just after my youngest daughter, Nina, was born. And so the whole crew are there. And I'm assuming that everybody is in this group photo, which I think was taken at one of our wedding anniversaries. I don't know, it's outside our house. And pretty much everybody who was at the time in existence was there. Of course, we've had considerable additions now.
You've created your own tribe, really. It's like quite impressive.
Yes, yes. It's as I think make fairly clear in my memoir, I am not sure I did the right thing in devoting so much time to my public life. Something has to give, and I think what gave what was family life. And at some point, I also refer to a conversation I had at the Shabbat dinner table with my children when I first became very active outside the house, which happened in 1973 when I took on Peleth, which was a very full-time job for me. At the beginning, I was also still teaching full-time at the university, and where I also had an administrative post. And I asked them how they felt about my being away so much, being absent. And my second son said, "You're not always here when one needs you." To which the oldest of my daughters, who was next in line after him, said, "But when you're here, you're much more interesting than the mothers who are always cleaning the windows." And I should have listened more to him. But what she said was, more gratifying, more what I wanted to hear. And sometimes one hears what one wants to hear better than one hears things that one doesn't so much want to hear.
Well,
And I think this brings me back to a very difficult problem still. Combining parenthood, and I'm deliberately saying parenthood, not motherhood. Combining parenthood with working life, professional life, and with communal life. I don't know whether one can do all three equally effectively at one and the same time, and whether it isn't wiser to say, okay, while the children are young and need me more, I'm going to delay my public activity. But then, or to say, no, there's an urgent need, and I must fulfill my task in dealing with this need. I think it's an eternal problem. It's a problem for men as much as for women, except that women, of course, being considered the prime caretakers and the prime homemakers and so on, probably feel it much more. I don't know how many men are conflicted about this need to decide between professional or social activity and parenting. And that's, again, I come back to something I said right at the beginning somewhere. I think, that parenting is a job for two people. And until our society wakes up to that fact and makes working hours compatible, or the other way around, makes family life compatible with working hours, and gives adequate family leave. The way some Scandinavian countries realize that young parents need more time with their children. But how many countries do that? How many countries make it possible for parents to spend 2 years on parental leave? But that would be the ideal, But then the children grow up also, they realizing that parenting is a job for two people.
At least two people, I would say.
There is so much still to do. So much.
There is, and I wish we had time to both continue the conversation and solve the world's problems. But I appreciated that you brought it back around to what is still left to do, because that ultimately is the goal, right? Is that the work that we do at the Jewish Women's Archive, the work that you do in the world, is about how we fortify ourselves and build the communities we need to support us and everyone better, to make the world a better place. And I think we can't do that when we don't know one another's stories. We can't do that when we don't hear, like you just expressed, some of what the challenges are, because those challenges are personal challenges, but they're also social challenges, and we shouldn't be left holding them individually and feeling like individual failures. It's that we don't have the structures, that the systems in place to make it possible to do all the things that we are capable of doing. You know, you've had the chance to do many, many things, and I was very happy to hear that you're in the process of preparing your personal papers to be archived at the National Archive. I would love at some point to have another conversation about what that was like. But
actually, I think I'm overdoing things a bit, but because I tend to use scraps of paper for what I consider important notes. But then I always think, why didn't we keep Shakespeare's grocery bills? He probably jotted down a few lines of inspiration on the back of them. Exactly. So really, you know, one must ever throw anything away, because there's always an archive that is interested in taking every little scrap of paper, right?
Yes, there is wisdom in every document and something to be learned from it. And I want to thank you, Alice, for this conversation, as well, of course, as for your many decades of fighting for the rights of women.
Well, thank you. Thank you.
And for
I'm sorry for wandering. I do meander.
No, not at all. This was delightful.
I hope it was of interest.
This was delightful. This brings, I'm sad to say, an end to JWA's Global Day of Learning, but it is just the beginning for the Encyclopedia, which, as I said, will be continuing to grow over the coming months and years. I want to thank all of you for joining us and helping us celebrate the launch of the Shelvey Hyman Encyclopedia. Alice, your lifetime of activism reminds us that the work goes on, that we each have the capacity to be history makers. And I love what you said, in ways that we wouldn't necessarily expect, that often the best challenges are thrust upon us, and it is up to us to rise to the occasion. So thank you so much for being with us today, Alice.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And all the best of luck. And keep expanding, keep up with the times, you know.
We are doing our best. And I hope that all of you will, this celebration is just the beginning of JWA's celebration of our 25th anniversary, which is going to continue throughout the year. So please save the date for another big virtual celebration on Thursday, November 4th, and we'll have lots in between then as well. But I want to thank all of you, and thank you, Alice, and have a lovely rest of the day, everybody.
Well, I'm sure that if there is an afterlife, Moshe and your mother are sitting somewhere glowing with happiness.
I very much hope so, and that image makes me very happy. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.